rare guns of World War II. Never in the history of humankind have so many weapons been developed and produced as during World War II. The hyper-production of tanks, artillery, and especially infantry weapons reached into the millions. Some of these weapons became landmarks in the history of arms. Soldiers fought in battle equipped with MP40s, Thompsons, M1 Garands, Stens, and other legendary infantry weapons. On the other hand, there were also weapons that, for various reasons, were produced on a far smaller scale, sometimes in such small numbers that they were considered a rarity, unknown to the general public. Here's a list of the top 5 rare guns of World War II that you may have never heard of. Type 100. The Type 100 was not only the rarest Japanese-made submachine gun, it was the only one they ever produced in any significant quantity. Quite oddly, despite the fact that submachine guns were perfect for jungle warfare in the Pacific and Southeast Asia, the Japanese felt no explicit need to introduce this type of weapon into regular service. The Imperial Japanese forces had started to develop submachine guns as late as 1934, much later than any other major power. Their first 2 prototypes, the experimental Models 1 and 2, failed to meet military standards. But in 1940, the experimental Model 3 was accepted by Japanese military officials, and it entered mass production in 1942 as the submachine gun Type 100. There were 2 basic models of the Type 100. The first model, the Type 140, was a bulky weapon that fired an underpowered 8mm Nambu pistol round at a low rate of 450 rounds per minute. Far from being effective and prone to jamming, the Type 100 had several odd features such as a tangent rear sight, a bayonet lug, and even a bipod in some versions. The chrome-plated barrel was one of its best features. There was also a variant of the Type 140, which was designed for use by paratroopers that included a foldable buttstock. The second model was the Type 144, which appeared in 1944, when the Japanese decided to simplify and hasten the production process. The Type 144 was a much cruder but more reliable model. It was stripped of redundant details and had a significantly greater rate of fire at 800 rounds per minute. When you count both models of the Type 100, only 25,000 of these submachine guns were ever produced. UD-M42. Remarkably, one of the least known US-made submachine guns was also one of the best. The UD-M42 was a submachine gun designed by the High Standard Manufacturing Company for commercial use. When the war started, it drew the attention of the United Defense Supply Corporation. This organization was in close connection with the US Secret Service and had the intention of using the weapon for underground activities overseas. The UDSC took control of the project and handed over production to the Marlin Company, which started the job in 1942. The most interesting feature of the UD-M42 was that it had been chambered for 9mm parabellum rounds. This caliber was unusual for the United States market, but was quite common in Europe, because the American intention was to use the weapon for resistance operations in Nazi-occupied Europe. Even the overall appearance of the gun gave the impression that it was designed for irregular warfare, as it lacked any unnecessary features. At the same time, it was a high-quality weapon, made of well-machined parts, with a rate of fire of 700 rounds per minute. It was a reliable and very accurate gun that was easy to operate and easy to maintain, even in harsh conditions. A curious feature was the double 25-round box magazine that allowed for quick reloads. Yet another advantage for the resistance fighters who used it. Whether it was because of the specific requisites or because of the demanding and expensive production process, there were no more than 15,000 UD-M42s produced. Because of the fact that these weapons were used by the underground resistance, very few records of their use exist today. The few records that have been found document their use in the Mediterranean region. FG-42. Among the iconic weapons in the German arsenal that were produced in the hundreds of thousands, there were also some of equal quality made on a much smaller scale. One such weapon was the Volkssturmgewehr VG, or Paratrooper Rifle 42, a gun that was made at Hermann Göring's insistence, since he wanted his Luftwaffe paratroopers to have a better rifle than their army counterparts. The weapon was a mix of an assault rifle and a light machine gun. It was projected to be used as an assault rifle, but was chambered in the standard powerful 7.92mm cartridge. The FG-42 also had a sloped pistol grip, a large buttstock, and a bipod, features closer to the light machine gun concept. Even so, German paratroopers used it strictly as an assault rifle, not as a support weapon, because it was lighter than the standard Army G41 semi-automatic rifle. The FG-42 was considered to be a groundbreaking design that would eventually influence future weapons, such as the sheet metal and plastic construction for the American M60 machine gun. The FG-42 was a gas-operated weapon capable of both single-shot and automatic fire. Like many other German weapon designs, the FG-42 was a quality-made weapon, reliable and easy to handle. Its only drawback was the box magazine placed on the left side of the weapon. This position caused the gun to become unbalanced when firing bursts. Even though the FG-42 was a high-quality weapon, it was produced in a very limited quantity. Whether it was the high production costs or because German industry set their priorities to arming their regular army units, the FG-42 production was halted after only 7,000 were made. Despite being a true rarity in the vast German arsenal, this automatic rifle has earned a legendary status as one of the best weapons of the war. The most notable record of its use was during the famous Gran Sasso Raid, the airborne rescue mission of Benito Mussolini. MAS 38. The FG-42 may have been the weapon that saved Mussolini's life, but it was the French MAS 38 submachine gun that allegedly ended it. One of the Italian partisans that participated in the execution of the dictator was armed with the MAS 38, a relatively unknown submachine gun of World War II. The MAS 38 was the project of the famous French Saint-Étienne weapons manufacturing company. The development program lasted for several years until it was finalized in 1938 with a design that was ahead of its time. Unfortunately for the company, the client who ordered it, the French Army, decided not to purchase the weapon. However, once the war started, the French urged the factory to produce the gun in the highest quantities possible, but it was too late. The MAS 38 was a quality weapon made of parts machined from solid metal, which made it very durable, but also very expensive. It also required many production hours, too many to produce a large quantity of guns in a short amount of time. What made the MAS 38 distinctive to other designs of the time was that it was devoid of all unnecessary features. There was no bipod, bayonet fitting, muzzle brake, or any other feature that the majority of submachine guns had. The MAS 38 was a small weapon with a recoil spring housed inside a wooden buttstock. It was compact and very easy to handle. The only real problem was that it used the notorious 7.65mm Longueuil cartridge, which was a pistol round used exclusively in France. Because of the late start of production, less than 2,000 MAS 38 submachine guns were produced by the beginning of the war. In 1940, the German army captured the MAS factory and continued the gun's production, but its use was limited to France because of its unique chambering. The guns were distributed mainly to police units and German garrisons during the occupation of France. Some did find their way to nearby countries such as Italy, but in general, the MAS 38 was a true rarity during the war. DeLisle carbine. Compared to weapons produced in the hundreds of thousands during the war, those made in a few thousand units were considered a rarity. Still, there were service weapons that were produced on an even smaller scale of around 100 units. This was the case with the British DeLisle carbine. The DeLisle carbine didn't begin in the Project Bureau, but in the home of an engineer and gun enthusiast, William Godfrey DeLisle. He had made his first suppressed carbine in the .22 caliber for hunting small game. In early 1943, news of this innovative carbine reached the Combined Operation Headquarters of the British War Office. Major Sir Malcolm Campbell invited DeLisle to bring the carbine to his office, where he got acquainted with its most impressive feature, its near-silent operation. This was the beginning of a cooperation that resulted in the first prototype. The .45 ACP caliber DeLisle carbine passed its testing with the highest grades. It produced no muzzle flash and was completely silent at a distance of 50 yards or 46 meters. Major Campbell was thrilled and ordered more to be made. DeLisle was then transferred to the Ford Dagenham factory in London that was hired for production. The first phase ended in only 17 handmade carbines, constructed by using parts from other weapons. The base was a shortened Lee Enfield Mark III rifle stock with a locking mechanism. The bolt and receiver were modified for .45 caliber rounds and were fitted with an altered Thompson submachine gun barrel, while the magazine was taken from a Colt M1911 pistol. The most unique feature was its integrated 15-inch long suppressor, DeLisle's own invention. The initial batch of 17 carbines was immediately deployed to commando units. The weapon was officially accepted into service in 1944, after a series of comparison tests with suppressed Sten guns were made. The contract was given to the Sterling Armaments Company to produce 500 carbines, but by the end of the war they managed to produce only 130. The Sterling version was different from the original in several features, most notable of which were an added pistol grip and a foldable buttstock. The DeLisle carbines were used exclusively by British commando units, though a few found their way into the hands of operatives from the Special Operations Executive. Due to the nature of their operations, there are very few records of where these carbines were used. Though sidelined from the main course of events, these rare guns of World War II nevertheless made their way into the history of small arms. It was only a set of circumstances rather than their quality that caused them to never enter mass production on a significant scale. In the hands of soldiers across all theaters of war, these guns were as lethal as other weapons that were produced on a far larger scale.
The Kolibri. Mini pistol. The Kolibri is the smallest commercially available centerfire cartridge semi-automatic pistol made in history. The Kolibri was designed by an Austrian watchmaker named Franz Fanel and financed by Georg Grabner. Patented in 1910, it was produced around 1914 before the outbreak of World War I. Its name, Kolibri, is German for hummingbird, which is one of the smallest birds. While it appeared as a novelty, it was marketed as a ladies' self-defense weapon against criminals that was compact enough to fit in a handbag. The Kolibri had an overall length of 2.8 inches or 7 centimeters and had a blowback action like a normal pistol. Due to its scale and manufacturing technology of the time, it lacked rifling, making it very inaccurate. The magazine would carry 6 rounds, which was difficult to load. The caliber was just 2.7 millimeters, and its cartridge weighed just 5.3 grams or 82 grains. A 3mm version of the Kolibri was also made later on, which used a lead bullet instead of a jacketed bullet like the 2.7mm caliber. The pistol had a muzzle velocity of around 200 meters per second or 656.2 feet per second and a muzzle energy of just 4 joules or 3 foot-pounds. Its recoil was non-existent. Questionable beyond killing rodents, the bullets were weaker than a pellet gun and would even bounce off a woolen coat. But perhaps it could have done some harm if shot at a criminal's face in self-defense. 1,000 of these pistols were produced from 1914, with production interrupted at the outbreak of the war, and production of larger 3mm and 4mm versions continuing until 1938. Most Kolibri pistols were lost, destroyed, or taken by foreign soldiers as souvenirs in Central Europe during the 2 World Wars.
Last-ditch Axis weapons, World War II. In the latter half of World War II, the Axis powers continually found themselves cut off from resources they had earlier in the war. Without the materials needed to keep their massive war machines going, the Japanese and German forces began scrambling to find ways to support their forces while using the least amount of resources possible. This generally meant making crude forms of their current weapons, finding ways to dramatically simplify production, or even making completely new and oftentimes extremely simple firearms. MP3008. Type: submachine gun. Place of origin: Germany. In the waning days of the Second World War, the German military was looking at anything and everything they could field. One answer had been sitting in their faces the whole time: the British Sten submachine gun. Already designed as an emergency weapon by the British, the Sten was lightweight, simplistic, effective, very reliable in close quarters, and above all else, extremely simple to manufacture. For the British, the Sten replaced the highly expensive Thompson submachine guns they had been purchasing from the United States. So, to the Germans, creating their own version of this already existing emergency weapon was an all-too-easy idea. At first, Mauser created the Gerät Potsdam, an exact copy of the Sten Mark II. Then the company was instructed to simplify the design further, creating the Gerät Neumünster, officially called the MP3008. From the Sten to the MP3008, only one serious change was made. The magazine of the MP3008 was locked in a vertical position, unlike the lateral magazine that protruded off the left side of the sten. Aside from this small change, the two submachine guns were almost completely identical. In total, only about 10,000 MP3008s would be produced. The MP3008 would be produced throughout 1944 and 1945, and would oftentimes find themselves in the hands of auxiliary troops, or in the hands of Germany's foreign allies in occupied states such as Czechoslovakia. After World War II, the MP3008 still found service with many of these auxiliary troops until they were eventually washed out by the native designs or other imports. Volkssturmgewehr VG 15. Type, semi-automatic rifle. Place of origin, Germany. Maybe the most famous of Germany's last-ditch weapons is the Volkssturmgewehr. The name is translated as the People's Assault Rifle. This oddly shaped and clearly cobbled-together rifle was a mainstay of the German Home Guard, known as the Volkssturm, or People's Storm. This rifle was supposed to give extra firepower to the severely undertrained and under-equipped Volkssturm militia that was used as the final stopgap between the Allies and the complete collapse of the Third Reich. The Volkssturmgewehr was both an extremely rushed and impractical design. The rifle used the standard magazine of the STG-44 and its 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz round. Unlike the STG-44, the Volkssturmgewehr was purely a semi-automatic rifle. The production of the Volkssturmgewehr itself was extremely crude. Almost all of the firearm's construction was made from stamped or folded metal, therefore it could be made with even the simplest of manufacturing tools. The only part of the weapon that wasn't made of stamped metal was the bolt itself. The bolt was actually somewhat of an advanced one. It used a simplified blowback action that only uses one moving part, the bolt itself. This, in theory, would reduce the recoil. The Volkssturmgewehr was held together with simple bolts and rivets. While this made the firearm somewhat more rugged, this meant that it could not be easily disassembled for maintenance. So, if there were any issues with the gun, it was often thrown away and replaced. Einstossflammenwerfer 46. Type, throwaway flamethrower. Place of origin, Germany. One of the most feared weapons of all time is the flamethrower. The German army had made good use of the flamethrower all across the world. But these giant devices were expensive and complicated to produce, and they required specialized training that would take up valuable time, as the Führer called more and more people to the front, many of whom would receive little to no formal training. In order to combat this issue, a lightweight, portable, tubular, single-shot flamethrower was pressed into service in 1944. This was the Einstossflammenwerfer, of which little information is known. In English, literally meaning the single-shot flamethrower, it was just a simple metal container filled with fuel with a nozzle and a trigger at the front. Once the trigger was pulled, the entire contents of the canister would be emptied, projecting a single burst of flame for less than a second to an effective range of about 30 yards. After this, it was thrown away. The flamethrower itself was tucked under the user's arm and held in place by a strap that went over the soldier's shoulder. Often, these flamethrowers proved to be more dangerous to the user than the enemy. The Einstossflammenwerfer found itself used by German paratroopers until the end of the war, and would ultimately end up in large numbers in the hands of the Volkssturm, as it was deemed that no training was necessary to use the Einstossflammenwerfer, despite it being so cumbersome. Approximately 30,700 were manufactured. Last-ditch Arisaka Type 99. Type, bolt-action rifle. Place of origin, Japan. Much like the Germans, the Japanese Empire was on its heels and was running dangerously low on supplies in the late years of the war. Conscripts with little or no training were being equipped with whatever could be found, and the standard-issue rifles of the Japanese Empire were stripped to their basic components in order to save on production time and material. At the beginning of the war, the Type 99 Arisaka was a well-made and very well-liked firearm that used a smooth Mauser-style action. This rifle would be stripped down to its core by the end of the war. Compared to the original rifle, the late-war version looked like a poor copy of its earlier self. The sights on the late-war Arisaka consisted of a stationary peephole rear sight without the adjustment for windage or elevation, which the original featured, while at the end of the barrel there was an unprotected blade foresight. These sights worked but lacked the finesse of the original rifle. Just behind the sights, the bolt itself was of a much worse quality than the original. Smooth, low-tolerance metalwork was replaced with crude, unfinished metal with little to no markings. This saved on machining time and allowed for less skilled machinists and metalworkers to produce these rifles. Metal pieces that were not absolutely necessary were removed from the gun entirely. This included the butt plate, which was stripped off and then replaced with a wooden butt plate, and the cleaning rod, which was removed completely and not given any kind of substitute. Although the metal construction at the end of the handguard was slimmed down and changed so as to not hold the cleaning rod, its bayonet lug was kept so that soldiers could still affix bayonets and charge enemy positions. Much like its metal components, the wooden body of the Type 99 was cut down wherever possible. The most noticeable change being that the finish on the original was completely removed, thus leaving the bare wood to face the elements with no protection. From there, the wooden handguard that used to run the length of the rifle was cut down to cover only about 1/2 of the barrel. And lastly, the finger groove under the rear sights were completely removed. Overall, the Japanese had removed and simplified anything they could without making the rifle dangerous to use, although that point is still up for debate. National Defense Rifle. Type: bolt-action rifle. Place of origin: Japan. With the Americans and even potentially the Soviet Union closing in on the Japanese home islands, the threat of invasion was very real, and the pre-existing civil defense leagues were starting to be mobilized in the event of an invasion. These home guard troops and guns could not be made fast enough or in large enough numbers to both outfit the frontline troops and the home guard, so even the hugely simplified Type 99 would not find itself in the hands of the home guard troops. Instead of an extremely simplified bare-bones rifle, the National Defense Rifle was issued out to members of the Home Guard. Little is known about these series of rifles, and they were not any kind of specific rifle. Basic designs were handed down from the Japanese government to workshops around the country, who were ordered to manufacture rifles chambered in either the 7.7 by 58mm Arisaka rifle cartridge or the 8 by 22 Nambu pistol cartridge. The finished works that were put out by these workshops were extremely simplistic and crude. Since each workshop had free rein of how they wanted to design their rifle, their design differed from workshop to workshop, but all versions had certain commonalities, such as a stock made from a single piece of wood. Oftentimes, this was just a plank with a slot cut into it in order to hold the barrel and trigger assembly and a single shot capacity. Although these rifles were supposed to be chambered to use standard Japanese ammunition, some did not even use cased ammo, but instead used a muzzle loader that used black powder. An unknown number of these rifles were produced, and none of them saw frontline action, as the invasion of Japan never occurred. Although most of these weapons did see combat in some form, they were produced in fairly limited numbers, and their production ceased with the end of the war. After the war, almost all of these weapons, except the MP3008, which went on to be used by many police forces in the Balkans and other Central and Eastern European countries, were immediately destroyed or sold off after the war. Today, they are extremely rare and oftentimes considered unsafe for use because of their crude and fast production methods.
The APS Underwater Assault Rifle. The APS rifle was developed by Vladimir Semenov along with the SPP-1 pistol during the 1970s in the Soviet Union, so that its frogmen could have the ability to shoot underwater. Previously, the only counterattack towards the threat of enemy frogmen in naval bases were a knife and an AK-47 carried in a waterproof case that could only be used on the surface. The design of the weapon is simple and crude, but it has a more effective range than a spear gun. The APS features a smooth-bore barrel, stamped steel construction, basic sights, and it fires from the open bolt. Its oddly shaped magazine with a 26-round capacity comes from its very long and narrow round. The ammunition is a 120mm long needle-like projectile, set in a standard case. Rate of fire, accuracy, and effective range depends on the depth that it's being fired. For example, at a 5-meter or 16-foot depth, the APS has an effective range of 30 meters or 98 feet. If the frogman goes down to 40 meters or 131 feet deep, the range decreases to 11 meters or 36 feet. Firing on the surface is possible with the weapon, but only allowed during extreme emergencies, as the weapon's service life degrades severely when operated out of the water. In 1975, the APS rifle was adopted by the Soviet Union and remains in service in Russia. However, they have since sought a replacement for the rifle.
The SPP-1 Underwater Pistol. Cold War Tech. The SPP-1, or Special Underwater Pistol, was developed by Vladimir Semenov and manufactured by the Tula Arms Plant, along with the APS underwater rifle during the late 1960s. Beforehand, the only counterattack for frogmen up to this point was a knife, so there was a need for a specially designed underwater weapon for the Soviet Navy to effectively take on enemy frogmen or ocean predators. The SPP-1 was fielded in 1971 in the Soviet Union, finally giving its frogmen the ability to effectively shoot underwater. The overall length of the weapon is 9.6 inches or 244 millimeters, making it quite long, a necessity due to its unique features. The pistol has 4 smooth-bore barrels which were hinged to the frame of the gun like a shotgun. 4 cartridges are loaded into this chamber, and the firing pin rotates each pull of the trigger. This ammunition was specially designed for its underwater purpose because a conventional bullet is weakened underwater and has a very limited range. The 4.5 by 39 cartridge consists of a 115mm or 4.53-inch long dart as the bullet, which sat in a 39.5mm case. These bullets are drag stabilized underwater, and its range decreases as the depth increases. At 5 meters or 16 feet deep, the effective range is around 17 meters or 56 feet. And if the frogman goes down to 20 meters or 66 feet deep, the range is 11 meters or 36 feet. At 40 meters or 131 feet deep, the range is just 6 meters or 20 feet. The SPP-1 can be fired above water, but this degrades the service life severely, and without the stabilization of water, its range and accuracy is poor. These bullets can penetrate an enemy frogman's padded underwater suit or faceplate, and to speed up loading in combat or in dark environments, a clip that holds all 4 rounds was often used. The design of the trigger guard and safety are oversized so that the frogman's bulky gloves could operate it comfortably. When the pistol was upgraded to the SPP-1M in 1979, this trigger guard was scaled up even more, and a spring was added above the sear to improve the trigger pull. To survive the harsh salt water of the world's oceans, the pistol is constructed from plastic and non-corrosive metals that are specially coated. One of the key differences between the SPP-1 and NATO's underwater pistol, the HKP-11, was that it could be reloaded in the field, whereas the latter had to be sent back to the factory for reloading. The SPP-1 underwater pistol is still used today by Russian forces, and the Chinese also copied the design as the Type QSS-05 underwater pistol. The Stinger. As the war intensified in the Pacific and American troops started to go on the offensive, it became apparent that the Marines lacked fire support whenever they rapidly advanced deep into enemy-held territory, especially in the jungle environment. Therefore, it was concluded that there was an urgent need for a machine gun that could keep up with the pace of the Marines as they landed on the beaches and rapidly pressed forward against enemy fortifications. They required something that was highly portable and could easily lay down heavy and devastating gunfire instantly when required at short notice. For this, U.S. Marines on the front line at the time used the M1919 Browning, a .30 caliber medium machine gun for this role. The M1919 was rugged, reliable, and highly effective, but required at least a crew of 2 men, one being the gunner who carried the tripod and some ammunition, and an assistant gunner who carried the actual gun itself along with a box of spare parts and tools. The machine gun itself was heavy, weighing in the region of 31 pounds, and took a considerable amount of time to set up as it was tripod mounted. Therefore, it was much better suited to a defensive role. To overcome this problem, the Marines also used the BAR light machine gun, which was much lighter and with its bipod allowed just 1 man to carry and use it. It was even agile enough that it could be fired by the user when stood up. The BAR had been very advanced for its time in World War I, but 25 years later it was woefully inadequate as a squad's automatic weapon. For its rate of fire was very slow, and with a magazine capacity of just 20 rounds, it could run out of ammo after just a few seconds of sustained firing. So while the U.S. military debated what to do about this shortfall in their weapons arsenal, Marines on the front line decided to tackle the problem themselves and create their own weapon by modifying whatever they could lay their hands on from the battlefield. As a basis of these improvised weapons, it was decided to use the AN-M2 machine gun. This was used by tail gunners on a wide number of U.S. planes, including the Devastator torpedo bomber, the Dauntless dive bomber, and the Avenger torpedo fighter bomber. The reason for this was that the AN-M2 was a third lighter than the standard M1919 fire support medium machine gun, and it also had twice the firepower. And as it was in mass production at the time, spare parts were in plentiful supply. So during 1943, some AN-M2s were salvaged from the wings of crashed U.S. naval planes and were modified for field testing by adding machine gun spade grips and modifying their tail gunner mounts into a type of tripod. They became known as Stingers, and these improvised weapons proved moderately successful but were still awkward to deploy. Then, during the Bougainville Island campaign in the territory of New Guinea that started in November 1943, a Marine private called William H. Colby simply adapted his Stinger by getting rid of its clumsy mount and replacing it with a BAR bipod. This proved highly effective, and on November 25th, Colby and his Stinger were credited with driving off a Japanese attack when his platoon was ambushed. But there was still an issue with the Stinger. It could not be fired either stood up or on the move due to the use of the spade grips. So two Marines, Lieutenant Gray and Sergeant Grevich, encouraged by their commanding officers, developed an improved Stinger from cannibalized weapon parts. They used parts from 3 different weapons. They still used the AN-M2 medium machine gun as the basis for the Stinger, but added an M1 Garand wooden butt and a new specially designed trigger to make firing the weapon that much easier, as well as incorporating Private Colby's idea of using the BAR bipod. Though they didn't stop there. Further improvements included adding a 100-round box magazine that held a link belt of ammunition and incorporating the BAR's rear gun sights for improved accuracy. As a nice finishing touch, they painted them all a camouflaged color. The resulting weapon was just over 40 inches long and weighed 6 pounds less than the M1919 medium machine gun. This made the weapon much more portable and was able to be carried and used by just one man. The only drawback found with these guns was that they could easily overheat due to their exceptionally high rate of fire of up to 1,350 rounds per minute. Originally, this wasn't a problem, as these air-cooled machine guns were naturally cooled by the 300-mile-an-hour slipstream that was created when the aircraft they were mounted on were in flight. But this problem of overheating when used by the Marines on the ground was made manageable once they were taught to fire the Stinger in short bursts. Just 6 of these improved versions of the Stinger were built. They were subsequently issued to a handful of Marines and saw service in 1945 at the amphibious assault at Iwo Jima. Corporal Stein of the 28th Marines was one of these Marines to be issued with the new improved Stinger machine gun. Stein was to use his to great effect during his short time on the island. The improved Stingers, though crude-looking, were highly effective, and there was serious consideration given to put this design into large-scale production. But then the war ended, and the plan was permanently shelved. No example of a Stinger machine gun is known to exist today. The Hellriegel, 1915, secret weapon. The Standschutz Hellriegel 1915 was an Austro-Hungarian prototype submachine gun developed in 1915. Little is known about this weapon. What is known is that the weapon fed from either a 160-round drum magazine or 20-round stick magazine and was water-cooled using a leather-covered water jacket. It is believed it would be employed as a machine gun for the Standschutz, the Austrian home guard. It would be capable for sustained defensive fire in a fixed position and would still be light enough to use walking fire in an advance. It is speculated that the weapon functioned by direct blowback and had a rate of fire between 550 to 650 rounds per minute. Pictures of the testing show the firer wearing a thick belt, which may have helped with walking fire. He would be followed by an ammo bearer who would carry extra ammunition on a wooden carrying case on his back. It seems that the drum magazine may have had reliability issues due to its design and was meant for stationary firing while the magazine was in a cradle. The stick magazine would be meant for walking fire. While the weapons seemed to have a lot of potential, it seems all development of the Hellriegel ceased after 1915, as no further information has come out. The Fedorov Avtomat, World War I. The Fedorov Avtomat was a groundbreaking design that was ahead of its time.
Developed by Captain Fedorov first as a semi-automatic rifle and then as a fully automatic rifle, the Fedorov Avtomat was submitted to trials in 1913 and was finally adopted in 1916. The Fedorov Avtomat was a select-fire, closed-bolt rifle that had a rate of fire of 400 rounds per minute and weighed 9.7 pounds. It was chambered in the Japanese 6.5 by 50 Arisaka cartridge, which was plentiful instead of its own specific cartridge as first proposed to cut down on development time. It was not deployed like a battle rifle or assault rifle as we would imagine today, but as a machine gun. It was issued to teams of a gunner and an ammo bearer. Due to Russia's limited manufacturing abilities, the complex Fedorov Avtomat required hand fitting, so spare parts were few and far between, which meant that each weapon was only issued with one magazine and had to load all 25 rounds via stripper clips. It was soon rushed into combat on the Romanian front in 1917, just in time for the Kerensky offensive. It was also issued to air crews in an attempt to replace other automatic weapons in use, such as the Shosha. Accounts of its use were extremely positive, but in 1917, Russia dropped out of World War I and a civil war ensued, making production difficult. It was used during the Russian Civil War by the Red Army, and production resumed after the Communists gained power. Production continued until 1925 when the Red Army decided to stockpile all weapons that did not fire the standard domestic rifle round of 7.62 by 54R. However, this was not the end of the Fedorov Avtomat's usage. During the Winter War against Finland in 1939, the Red Army reintroduced the Fedorov Avtomat due to a lack of automatic weapons. It served well in the conflict, but most, if not all, examples were scrapped by the Red Army after the war. In all, the Fedorov Avtomat was ahead of its time and would have most likely contributed more to firearms development if political unrest and misfortune didn't hinder its production and development. Very few Fedorov Avtomats have survived, and only 3,200 were made. Some historians classify the weapon as the world's first assault rifle, while others describe it as the assault rifle's ancestor.